5 years had passed since I last set foot in my parents' house, but somehow the gravel under the tires sounded unchanged, like time could not wear down the bones of the past, only polish them sharper. My name is Elise Jacobs, and the last thing I remember before leaving home was the color of my mother's lipstick as she said, "This family survives by rules, not by love." When I took David's hand and walked out that spring night, it was with half a heart and enough bitterness to salt the wounds for a lifetime. In all those years, birthdays were fields left fallow, Thanksgiving spent with people who knew my story only from the outside, and every holiday a new reminder that some families would rather be right than kind. I built my world with David from the ground up, brick by patient brick, learning quiet Saturday mornings and laughter that didn't sting. His parents showed me calm steadiness I had only read about in library books, the kind of love that was never a carrot dangled or a leash pulled tight, just warmth. I had convinced myself I didn't need to look back. That peace is what you make with empty chairs. But then an envelope arrived in the mailbox. My mother's handwriting, slanted and immaculate, the curves of a woman who had never written without a ruler under the page. "Elise, your father wants you home for his 65th birthday. You are welcome to bring your husband." That one word, welcome, left more salt than invitation. I showed David the letter. His face unguarded, brave, and only a little worried. "We can go," he said. "If you want to." I did. Or I thought I did, that morning in late October, when the leaves turned to coins on the ground and the wind was full of endings. I picked my old blue dress, the one that fell to my knees and said, "Grown woman, not prodigal daughter." David wore his good brown jacket, the one he'd gotten as a promotion gift, and put his hopeful smile on like armor. We drove in silence for most of the way, the radio low, my hands sweating on the wheel, his resting quietly on my knee. When we pulled up to the house, nothing had changed and everything had. The box hedges trimmed too neat, the porch light already on at noon, a welcome mat that lied as well as any person I'd ever met. My mother opened the door with a rigid smile, barely glancing at David as she ushered us in, the hallway echoing with family photos in expensive identical frames. She greeted me with what passed for affection in our house, a brief, brittle press of her lips to my cheek, then a step back to let my father take over. He stood in the dining room, hands folded like a judge, his eyes meeting mine with the flat expectation of a man reviewing a ledger, not welcoming a daughter. "Elise," he said, then nodded at David. "And this is your husband." Not a question, not a greeting, just a label. David extended his hand with the same warm confidence he brought everywhere else in life. My father shook it, the gesture brief and cold, before retreating behind his glasses and the looming dining table like a king defending a withering kingdom. The house was full of relatives I barely recognized, my cousins in pressed shirts, aunts and uncles with polite smiles, and a sea of faces that tracked every movement, eager for cracks. My mother led us to the living room, pointedly ignoring the seat beside her, so I sat with David on the faded couch by the window. The conversation started innocuous, weather, work, the drive, until my Aunt Karen glanced at David and with a forced laugh asked, "So remind me, David, what is it you do again?" He smiled easily. "I'm a mechanic in aviation, mostly small aircraft. I love it. Keeps me grounded but always close to the sky." The room went still for a heartbeat. My father's lips pressed tighter. My mother's eyes flicked to the carpet. Even my cousins exchanged quick looks. "Interesting," my father said, drawing out the word. "And how did someone like you two meet?" David answered honestly. "Elise's car broke down outside my mom's old house. She tried to fix it herself. I offered her a ride and she said, 'Not unless you're better with transmissions than my last boyfriend.'" Nervous laughter filled the room, but the air felt brittle, as if too much truth would shatter it. The first real blow came at dinner. My mother poured wine only for the family, offering lemonade from a jug to David. My uncle joked, "Guess you're driving back to your side of town tonight?" My father, never one for subtlety, asked David if he had ever considered moving up to more respectable work, something that matched Elise's background better. I felt the old shame rising in my cheeks just as David answered, voice gentle but unyielding, "I'm proud of what I do. I fix things. Sometimes people too." The table went rigid, silverware paused midair. My mother cleared her throat. Elise always had such potential. Top of her class, scholarships, a future in law. "It was so fast, you're leaving." Many people wondered why you ran away. I stared at her hands, immaculate but trembling, and realized this wasn't a homecoming. It was an ambush. My father looked at David with thinly veiled contempt. There are standards in this family. Maybe next time you should ask before bringing unexpected guests. The humiliation was slow and public, each comment carefully worded so no one could accuse them of open cruelty, but clear enough to leave scars. I reached for David's hand under the table, threading my fingers through his, steadying myself on the one truth that had ever been mine. I chose him every day, not because he could be changed, but because with him I never had to apologize for standing where I belonged. And as my parents tore him down, one snide remark, one icy question, one silent reminder at a time, I realized the reunion I'd imagined never existed. On the other side of silence was only more silence. And I wasn't sure yet if I'd ever let them speak through me again. Dinner slid forward on rails of formality, every plate a stage for polite injury and polished manners just sharp enough to draw blood. The roast was carved with precision, passed down the table by my father like a seal of approval never destined for us. David and I sat at the far end, backs to the window, our presence set apart by a single place card with his name written in a different ink, a small, officious insult. My mother ran conversation like a boardroom, steering talk to her favorite lands, my lost potential, the impressive exploits of my younger brother Alex, Yale Law corporate trainee, the archer of this family's next generation, the new patio renovations. The sentence she repeated all evening was, "We're just so proud of those who build lasting things." Each time, her gaze would rest on me and then slide past David as if he were part of the furniture. The room felt full of invisible walls, the kind built of old money and older wounds. Relatives took turns peppering David with compliments so thin they slipped straight into barbs. "Must be nice to work with your hands. Do you ever imagine saving up for an office job someday?" Or, "I hear pilots make a lot, so you must see a brighter future from down there." He replied with unfailing patience, never rising to their bait, always meeting insult with a smile that held the quiet strength of someone who survived harder storms. Sometimes he squeezed my hand under the table, a silent signal that I didn't need to save him, didn't need to apologize on his behalf. But for every small defense I mounted, my father doubled down. When my cousin's fiancé described an upcoming trip to Europe, my father said loudly, "Some people prefer to stay close to home, safe, familiar work, familiar faces. Not everyone has the ambition for more." The message was clear. Marrying me was the limit of David's reach. The worst came with dessert. My mother brought out the family china, but for David placed a plain mug and called it "just in case." When he laughed, "Because what else could one do?" she added. "You know, sometimes nice things break if you're not used to them." Even now, I wonder if anyone realized how hard I worked to keep the trembling out of my voice. I wanted to stand, table my anger, announce to the room that competent hands built the very world they took for granted. But rage is heavy, and in families like mine, confrontation looks like weakness. Instead, I sat straighter, my breath shallow, and said simply, "David is as careful with what he loves as anyone at this table." The silence that followed was absolute, as if the house itself paused to listen, or perhaps to judge. Finally, my father turned to me and asked the question that had chased me out years ago. "Is this really the life you wanted?" He expected shame, maybe even regret. I stared at my empty plate and met his eyes squarely across the table. "It's not the life you taught me to want. But it's the only one where I get to decide who I am." I saw my mother's jaw tighten, heard a cousin stutter through a change of subject, and watched from the corner of my eye as David's shoulders eased just a fraction, relieved that I had said what he never would have asked me to. The rest of the night passed in a blur of forced farewells, air kisses, and chilly handshakes at the door. No one asked to visit. No one offered to walk us out. The porch lights glared down, unforgiving. As the car doors closed, I felt my body let go of a weight I hadn't realized I had carried for 5 years. A backpack full of apology. A heart half-packed in cardboard for a return that would never be welcomed. David started the car in quiet, letting the wheels crunch the driveway gravel, neither of us speaking until the house disappeared behind the last turn. That's when he whispered, "I'm sorry." I looked at him, my strong, patient husband with hands nicked from honest work, heart tender enough to forgive strangers, shoulders broad enough to carry my grief, and shook my head. "No. Not you. We drove through the winding, silent streets, past the neon-lit gas station, past all the memories that no longer held us, and toward a tomorrow where our family would be the one we chose, not the one that had chosen to forget how to love. What I didn't know in that moment was that the night's bitterness would not be the end. The true cost of returning home would reveal itself before morning, and for the first time in my life, I would learn what happens when you let go of the hope for their approval and choose instead to defend the future you built with your own hands. We arrived back in our small apartment just after midnight, the city lights blinking through the blinds, the air heavy with leftovers from an evening neither of us could quite swallow. I dropped my purse on the counter, kicked off the shoes that had pinched all night, and let myself breathe for the first time since crossing my parents' threshold. David was quiet, uncharacteristically so. He moved through our kitchen with a carefulness born not from hurt pride, but the exhausted ache of one who is finally done auditioning. I poured wine into mismatched mugs, handed him one, and we sat across from each other at our little table, hands clasped between us. "I'm glad we went," he said eventually, eyes searching mine for something, relief, permission, forgiveness. I wasn't sure. "I wouldn't have wanted you to regret not trying." I nodded, unsure whether gratitude or sorrow was the heavier companion. "You didn't deserve that," I whispered. He shrugged, a weary smile tracing his mouth. "Families protect their myths, not their people. I think deep down, yours wanted to remind you what missing them should cost." We clinked mugs. We didn't toast. Even in pain there was gentle solidarity. The next day I called out from work, claiming a cold so I wouldn't have to field questions about how my weekend with the family had gone. David returned to the hangar. He always found solace among engines and honest metal, things that responded to skill instead of pedigree. I walked the city for hours, my body restless, my thoughts migratory. I revisited places where we'd built our new rituals. The humble corner cafe where David first recited my favorite poem over burnt coffee. The second-hand bookstore where I'd bought our wedding gift. A dictionary already annotated by generations of hopeful readers. Each stop was proof that love wasn't a resume or a title or a seat at my parents' immaculate table. In the afternoon, with the autumn light slanting golden across the floors, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. But the area code was home. I hesitated before answering. Old reflexes still ran deeper than new freedoms. On the other end, my cousin Sarah's voice sounded rushed, anxious. "Elise, I shouldn't be telling you this, but something happened after you left. There was a scene." She took a breath, then everything spilled out in a jumble. As the family sat in judgment over the night's dinner, my mother had taken the opportunity to narrate the cost of my choices, openly comparing David to every hometown cautionary tale. My father, fueled by the encouragement, announced, within earshot of an investor no less, that some family members lack all ambition. They marry beneath themselves, then expect to be lifted anyway. Apparently, the investor had a son who worked as a mechanic and had been quietly proud of it. The man had not only taken offense but told a few others, and before the night was over, the dinner party divided. Half the room bristling at my parents' arrogance, the other half gossiping that maybe, just maybe, the Jacob's name was losing its luster. Sarah's warning was kind, but it was her last sentence that caught me raw. "Your brother Alex told everyone you'd come back for money, not love. He said David couldn't provide and that you'd be back again soon enough, asking for help you didn't deserve." My vision blurred. I sat in our sunlit room, every rib aching, anger threatening to bloom into tears, but then the pain was replaced by clarity. Families build stories to keep the uncomfortable out. By midnight my phone rang again, this time David's mother. Nancy's voice was gentle but sure. The sound of someone who had no interest in performance. "Elise darling, we're proud of what you've made with David. We all saw the man he is." I tried to respond but tears finally slipped down my cheeks. Kindness after injury sometimes hurts worse. That night, David came home dust-smudged and wind-burned, a small wildflower in his hand. "You always said you could grow a forest from the cracks." He wrapped me in a hug that was home and future all at once. We locked the door against the cold and settled into our small kingdom, a place built of everyday resilience, where the only expectations were the promises we made each morning. To choose each other, to protect what we built, and to let the world's noise fade behind the closed blinds. I looked at the wedding photo on our shelf. Just the two of us, sunlight on our faces, no one watching, no one judging. I whispered quietly to myself, being chosen is enough. Pretending never was. Beyond our window the city's pulse beat steady. A song for those who survived and those who would never be allowed back. And as the dark thickened outside, my parents' rules lost the only audience that gave them power. The days that followed felt both lighter and unexpectedly charged. A strange relief, like muscles relaxing after holding tension for years. And yet a certain ache when you stretch newly healed skin. I threw myself into work, into chores, into all the small rituals that made our apartment a place of safety. Sweeping floors, playing old records, learning recipes I used to be too tired to attempt. David hugged me more often, a silent "I see you" in every embrace. And yet I sensed a heaviness in him too, the way shame sometimes finds you when you've been publicly diminished in the eyes of those who ought to have welcomed you in. I caught him hesitating at the mirror one morning, his jaw set in determination. "You don't need fixing," I told him, sliding arms around his waist. "You are more than their approval or their judgment." He smiled, grateful but unconvinced. That weekend, the world found us in a way neither of us had expected. A letter with my father's sharp handwriting landed in our mailbox. No return address, just the brittle assurance that anything worth saying carried its own weight. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, a single sheet. "Elise, your visit was a disappointment. I regret extending the invitation. Given your choices, if you intend to tie your future to mediocrity, do not expect this family to rescue you when the inevitable happens. Standards are standards. When you are ready to put this behind you and move forward with dignity, this door will open, but not for him." Underneath, my mother had added in smaller script, "Your father is hurt. Families forgive eventually." I read the note twice, then handed it to David. He scanned it, face unreadable, then tore it in half and dropped the pieces into the trash. Their forgiveness costs too much. That night I watched him fall asleep, his breathing careful and measured, and realized how trauma doesn't just ride your back. It sneaks into your shoulders, your sleep, your sense of self. I wondered how many times I'd let toxic hope my parents would change, delay the real project of building peace in the family I was already creating. I wrote nobody back. I told nobody at work. But the echo of rejection tangled in me for days until finally, something subtle but profound happened at David's job. His supervisor called him aside at the hangar. "Heard from a friend of your wife's family that you don't belong in aviation," the supervisor said, an eyebrow raised. "But then, that old man's never gotten his own hands dirty. You're the best I've got. If they can't see that, let it be their loss." Relief and pride warred in David's face. "Thank you," he managed. When he told me, I laughed, not with mockery, but with the wild, giddy relief that comes from realizing the world can reward integrity in ways your old life never could. That evening I baked a cake with oranges and brown sugar, something new and special, and we ate it in the living room with the windows open to autumn wind. We made a list, half serious, of the family traditions we'd start. "No silent treatment," David said, and I added, "Nobody eats alone." We promised ourselves our children, if there ever were any, would never measure their worth against a grandparent's dinner table. The past week's wounds still ached, but the healing had begun to scar. The mark less of shame, more of testimony. As the season changed and gratitude slipped quietly into our lives, I found myself less haunted by what if, and more certain that closing the door, even on blood, was sometimes the only way real light could get in. And as we shared our triumphs and failings with friends who celebrated effort, not pedigree, I felt the first trembling certainty that my parents could never again decide the shape of my happiness. The coming weeks sealed the lessons that no reunion, however painful, could erase. My parents' silence returned in place of letters, more heavy somehow than any worded warning, as if they believed indifference was their last defense. But our apartment blossomed in their absence, filled with the kind of chosen family that shows up with casseroles and laughter and apologies that sound like, "I missed you." David threw himself into his work, earning small recognition, a local news piece about the community hangar, his picture beside a gleaming Cessna, grease under his nails, eyes proud and unashamed. One evening, as we sat on the fire escape watching the sun melt behind city roofs, he said quietly, "You know, I don't want to forgive them for you, but sometimes I do wish it didn't hurt so much." I squeezed his hand, knowing my scars were different but no less deep. "You don't have to forgive them, David. You just have to outgrow what they thought you were. In the small world we had chosen, healing was slow but real. At Thanksgiving, as our table filled with friends, there was no empty chair for ghosts, only a toast to beginnings built on stubborn hope. Brady, my brother's old friend, stopped by with his wife and confessed over pumpkin pie. They still talk about you at family parties, Elise. They say you could have been anything. I smiled, no longer angry at the word could. I am everything I need to be. And so is he. After dessert, I found a message from my mother, short, tentative, no apologies, only, "I hope you're well. If you need anything." I deleted it without reply, not because I felt hate, but because I had finally learned what it meant to protect my real peace. December slid in with snow, and at David's work holiday party, a pilot's wife shyly thanked me. "My husband's a mechanic too." Your story made him feel seen. That night, walking home, I realized that the life I'd fought for wasn't about convincing the world. It was about refusing to apologize for a happiness built on respect instead of approval. On New Year's Eve, standing under cheap sparklers, I made a quiet vow, not to wait for a changed parent, not to hope for an apology that would tidy up the past, but to keep making this life every ordinary day from exactly who we were. I put my hand in David's, the man my family could not break, and whispered, "Here's to breaking the cycle." He just nodded, eyes shining. The years will be long and memory won't always soften, but I no longer mistake distance for loss, nor forgiveness for permission to be hurt again. My parents' table isn't mine anymore. The seat I'd always wanted was waiting quietly, in the home we built together, where love is served without conditions, where family means the hands that lift you up, not the voices that tear you down. If you're reading this and trying to decide whether to return to people who made you small, remember, the cost of peace is high, but the reward is everything you get to build that can never be taken away again. I brought my husband to meet my parents after 5 years. They tried to humiliate him for his past, his work, his love for me, but in the end their power stopped at the door we closed for good. The irony is, family dinners matter less when you finally feel like you belong at your own table. And that feeling, that's the only homecoming that counts.